The global stage is shifting quietly but decisively. Two of the world's most influential nations, China and Russia, are joining forces in ways that could fundamentally reshape the global order. Recent developments have caught international attention. China is cutting ties with American-made chips, and both China and Russia are increasingly trading without using the US dollar. This is not just another economic story. It signals a potential shift in who controls the flow of technology, finance, and power across the planet. For decades, the United States has held two key advantages: the dominance of the dollar and leadership in semiconductor technology. Every nation, every company, and virtually every global transaction has depended on these two pillars of American strength. Yet, both are now being challenged simultaneously. The timing is no coincidence. Beijing and Moscow appear to be constructing a system where Washington no longer dictates global rules. This is a real, ongoing shift, not a mere headline. The US dollar has long served as the world's primary reserve currency, facilitating trade, energy transactions, and financial settlements worldwide. Its influence gives the US enormous borrowing power, allowing it to fund government spending at relatively low cost. But the dollar's supremacy is eroding in key regions. In 2024, over 90% of trade between China and Russia was settled using their own currencies, the yuan and the ruble, marking a near-total departure from dollar reliance. Simultaneously, China has begun restricting who can buy and use American-made chips within its borders. The combined effect of these two moves, currency independence and tech control, could be transformative. Technology and currency have always been instruments of influence, controlling the chips that power devices and the money that facilitates trade grants significant leverage. When two global powers create parallel systems free from US technology and finance, the balance of global influence shifts. In this analysis, we explore how China's chip restrictions could impact US tech giants, how the dollar's diminished role in China-Russia trade weakens American financial dominance, and how these developments form part of a broader strategy to challenge decades of US hegemony. Beyond the headlines, there are less obvious critical developments. Secret supply chains, emerging alternative banking systems, and the gradual participation of other nations in this shift. Following these trends reveals a picture of a silent economic realignment. Chips, often misunderstood as mere components, are at the core of modern technology, powering smartphones, vehicles, AI, data centers, and advanced military systems. For countries seeking economic growth or strategic military capabilities, access to these semiconductors is essential. The US has dominated this sector for decades, with companies like NVIDIA, Intel, Qualcomm, and AMD controlling the most advanced technologies. Even when production occurs in Taiwan or South Korea, the designs, software, and equipment are largely American. This gives Washington extraordinary power. Policy decisions can control global access to high-end computing, making technology itself a strategic tool. Recent years have shown this power deployed as a political weapon, with access restrictions affecting both allies and adversaries. At the same time, the financial system's dependence on the dollar is being tested. Reduced reliance on US currency by China and Russia undermines confidence in dollar reserves and challenges America's financial leverage. This has ripple effects on trade, investment, and monetary policy globally. Countries are observing and responding, with some diversifying reserves, exploring alternative currencies, or investing in tangible assets like gold to hedge against dollar volatility. The intersection of technology and currency is becoming a central axis of power. A future world may see influence measured not by printing money or global investments alone, but by who controls essential technology and alternative financial systems. Understanding this evolving landscape is crucial. The shifts between the dollar, semiconductors, and global alliances point to a slow but profound reordering of international influence. Each policy decision, each trade adjustment, and each restriction signals broader ambitions. The combined strategies of China and Russia reflect careful planning to reduce dependence on U.S. systems and increase their global sway. As these trends continue, nations, investors, and policymakers must monitor the dual forces of technological control and currency realignment to anticipate how global power may be redistributed. The unfolding narrative is not speculative. It is observable through trade patterns, financial flows, and regulatory changes. This realignment is reshaping global markets, alliances, and strategic calculations. By examining the integration of technology restrictions and alternative currency systems, one sees a deliberate push to construct a multipolar world where U.S. dominance is no longer assured. As this silent transformation progresses, the implications for trade, finance, and geopolitical influence are immense. Companies reliant on American semiconductors, governments dependent on the dollar, and investors accustomed to the stability of traditional markets must recognize that the rules are changing. The convergence of these factors, the chip restrictions, the shift from dollar-based trade, and the strategic coordination of China and Russia, marks a historic recalibration in global economic and technological power, the effects of which will resonate for decades to come. The United States government began imposing strict export controls on the sale of advanced semiconductors and chip-making equipment to China. The official rationale was national security concerns, specifically the fear that China could use these powerful chips for military applications, advanced surveillance systems, or to strengthen its artificial intelligence capabilities. Washington also pressured allied nations, including Japan and the Netherlands, to limit their exports of critical technologies to China, cutting Beijing off from key tools such as lithography machines, essential for high-end semiconductor manufacturing. China responded strategically. The country's technology industry has long relied on imported chips, particularly those made with American designs and equipment. These restrictions hit major Chinese companies, including Huawei and Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, forcing them to reevaluate their supply chains entirely. In response, China began investing hundreds of billions of dollars to develop a domestic semiconductor industry from the ground up. The government created specialized funds, offered tax incentives, and encouraged local firms to produce alternatives to American chips. China's measures extended beyond building domestic production. Recognizing its own leverage, the country started restricting exports of certain rare earth minerals, including gallium and germanium, materials critical for chip production, electric vehicles, and advanced technologies. This move demonstrated that the semiconductor struggle would be reciprocal, signaling that global technology competition was not one-sided. At its essence, this battle is not merely commercial. It is about technological dominance and geopolitical power. Semiconductors have become the new oil. Whoever controls them wields influence over nearly every modern economic sector, from communications networks and energy grids to defense systems and financial infrastructure. Meanwhile, for nearly 8 decades, the U.S. dollar has been at the center of global trade and finance, facilitating the movement of oil, gold, and commodities worldwide. More than half of international transactions are conducted in dollars, and approximately 60% of global reserves remain dollar-denominated. This dominance grants the United States substantial influence, allowing it to shape global markets and enforce sanctions that can isolate nations economically. The dollar's power relies on trust, backed by the world's largest economy, deep capital markets, and the confidence that it retains value. Yet this very trust creates dependency. Many nations have become vulnerable to U.S. policy decisions, particularly when sanctions or financial restrictions are applied as foreign policy tools. Growing unease over this vulnerability has prompted certain countries to explore alternatives, especially China and Russia. Both have steadily reduced their reliance on the dollar, accelerating this shift in recent years following U.S.-led financial sanctions against Russia after geopolitical conflicts. Being cut off from Western banking networks, Moscow intensified efforts to trade and settle without the dollar. China observed similar risks. Prolonged tensions with Washington could endanger its reserves and trade routes. In response, the two nations began creating parallel financial systems. China has actively promoted its currency, the yuan, as a global trade alternative, establishing currency swap lines with dozens of countries, launching yuan-based payment systems, and encouraging partners in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East to settle trade in yuan. Russia, meanwhile, has converted a portion of its reserves into gold and other non-dollar currencies, building trade relationships with nations willing to operate outside the dollar system. The outcomes of these strategies are increasingly visible. Trade between China and Russia now bypasses the dollar almost entirely, reflecting a major shift in global financial flows. China's domestic chip industry is rapidly expanding, reducing reliance on foreign technology while securing control over critical supply chains. Both nations' actions signal a coordinated effort to diminish U.S. economic influence and establish alternative channels for trade and finance. By creating these parallel networks, China and Russia are challenging decades of dollar supremacy and U.S. technological dominance. The implications are profound. Countries dependent on dollar-based trade face new pressures, while the global balance of economic power begins to diversify. Investors, multinational corporations, and policymakers worldwide must navigate a world where technological and financial influence is increasingly multipolar. The semiconductor competition and dollar avoidance are not isolated developments. They represent interconnected strategies aimed at reshaping the rules of global commerce. As these trends continue, the long-term influence of the United States could be tested. While China and Russia consolidate power through innovation, control over critical resources, and alternative financial mechanisms. Observers should monitor both nations' chip production capabilities, currency initiatives, and international trade patterns closely, as these will reveal the evolving structure of global economic and technological power. Over 90% of trade between Russia and China is now conducted in their respective national currencies, the yuan and the ruble, representing a near total departure from dollar-based transactions. This is far more than symbolic. It reflects billions of dollars in trade that once moved through U.S.-controlled financial systems, now bypassing them entirely. Beyond these two countries, other BRICS nations, including India, Brazil, and South Africa, are exploring similar alternatives to reduce reliance on the dollar. Financial institutions across Asia, the Middle East, and even parts of Europe are piloting systems that allow cross-border payments without touching the U.S. currency. While these efforts are still in the early stages, they indicate a broader trend. a slow but deliberate move toward a multipolar financial system where the dollar is no longer the only viable option. For the first time in decades, the dollar's global dominance faces a genuine challenge. What began as a modest attempt to circumvent sanctions has evolved into a strategic campaign to reshape the global monetary landscape, with China and Russia leading the charge. In recent weeks, global media outlets reported that China had implemented a complete ban on U.S.-made semiconductors. Headlines painted a dramatic picture, sparking concern among investors, tech analysts, and multinational corporations that any action by China in the semiconductor sector could escalate tensions with the United States. However, when examined carefully, the story is more nuanced. There is currently no verified official confirmation of a nationwide ban covering every type of American chip. The reports appear to exaggerate a series of smaller, targeted measures that signal tighter restrictions rather than an outright prohibition. What is accurate is that China has intensified its oversight of foreign chips and their deployment within the country. This process accelerated after the United States expanded export controls on high-end chips destined for Chinese firms involved in artificial intelligence, defense, and other sensitive industries. Beijing has since quietly implemented policies that limit the purchase of certain American components, especially in strategic sectors such as telecommunications, energy infrastructure, and government systems. State-owned companies are being encouraged to source domestically or rely on non-U.S. alternatives, even if local technology is not yet at the same level as Western products. Some reports indicate that China is conducting comprehensive reviews of chip usage across major industries, identifying critical areas of dependency on U.S. technology. The ultimate goal is a gradual replacement of American components with Chinese or other foreign alternatives, a process often referred to as de-Americanization. This effort is deliberate and long-term, sending a clear signal. China seeks to reduce vulnerability to Washington's influence in sectors vital to national security and technological leadership. In parallel, China has leveraged its dominance over certain raw materials critical for semiconductor production. By imposing export restrictions on elements such as gallium and germanium, which are heavily relied upon by the U.S. and its allies, Beijing has demonstrated the ability to disrupt the global supply chain if necessary. This strategic maneuver serves as a reminder that control over critical resources operates in both directions. Industry experts and financial analysts widely agree that a complete ban on American chips is improbable at this stage, primarily because Chinese companies still depend on U.S. technology to maintain competitiveness. What is far more likely is a methodical, phased reduction in reliance on U.S.-made chips wherever feasible. Beijing may introduce stricter import screenings, limit purchases for government and public institutions, and provide substantial incentives for domestic firms to develop homegrown semiconductor solutions. This evolving policy is less about immediate severance and more about establishing long-term independence in technology, even at the cost of short-term efficiency or higher expenses. Taken together, these moves, trading in national currencies, gradual chip de-Americanization, and control over critical minerals, signal a profound shift in global economic dynamics. China and Russia are quietly building parallel financial and technological systems, challenging decades of U.S. dominance in both currency and semiconductors. As this strategy unfolds, the international community must monitor developments closely. Countries, corporations, and investors will need to adapt to a world where reliance on the dollar and U.S. technology is no longer automatic. The implications extend beyond finance and trade to geopolitics, national security, and technological leadership. By steadily reducing exposure to U.S. systems, China and Russia are reshaping the global balance of power, creating a multipolar world where economic and technological sovereignty takes precedence over dependence on traditional American dominance. Each small restriction China imposes on foreign technology builds toward a larger strategic goal, turning claims of an outright ban into a calculated realignment of global trade and technology flows. Meanwhile, the process of dollarization reversal between Russia and China has advanced far beyond symbolic gestures or political statements. It has become a structural transformation in the way both nations conduct trade, manage finance, and protect their economies from external pressure. For decades, the US dollar functioned as the default currency for almost all international transactions, including those between Moscow and Beijing. However, rising geopolitical tensions and repeated Western sanctions accelerated the push by both countries to replace dollar reliance with a system centered on their own national currencies, the yuan and the ruble. By early 2024, reports indicated that over 90% of trade between China and Russia was now settled directly in their local currencies. This includes oil, natural gas, machinery, and consumer goods, all processed without requiring U.S. dollars. Previously, these transactions flowed through American or European banks, giving Washington leverage via monetary oversight and sanctions enforcement. Today, trade bypasses those channels entirely, moving through local banks and bilateral agreements that maintain independence from Western financial systems. The mechanisms driving this shift are multifaceted. First, direct trade settlements allow exporters and importers to exchange goods and services using yuan or rubles instead of dollars. Second, central banks in both countries have established currency swap arrangements that provide liquidity in local currencies during times of financial stress. This ensures both sides can access the funds they need without relying on dollar reserves. Third, they are developing cross-border payment platforms as alternatives to the Western-dominated SWIFT network, allowing secure and independent international transactions. Beyond government initiatives, the private sector has quickly adapted. Russian energy firms now accept yuan payments from Chinese buyers, while Chinese tech and infrastructure companies pay Russian suppliers directly in rubles. Domestic financial markets have responded as well, with yuan-denominated bonds gaining traction in Moscow and ruble-based investment instruments emerging on select Chinese exchanges. This growing comfort with each other's currencies strengthens financial ties while reducing vulnerability to Western sanctions and currency fluctuations. The global implications of these changes are significant. As more trade bypasses the dollar, the currency's role as the world's primary reserve and settlement unit gradually erodes. Reduced reliance on dollars threatens U.S. influence over international finance and could decrease global demand for treasury bonds, which have traditionally been supported by foreign dollar reserves. For China and Russia, the benefits are clear: greater autonomy, stronger control over monetary policy, and fewer vulnerabilities to sanctions. For Western economies, however, this shift introduces new challenges, including increased financial fragmentation, reduced transparency in international transactions, and the rise of new centers of economic power operating beyond U.S. oversight. The deeper this de-dollarization trend goes, the more it signals a shift toward a multipolar financial world, one in which the yuan and ruble begin competing with the dollar in regions historically dominated by Western financial systems. Importantly, the global chip restrictions and the dollar shift are interconnected. They form part of a broader strategy that ties control over technology and financial independence together as the new foundation of global power. For China and Russia, facing growing pressure from the West, the message is clear: whoever controls technology and currency will shape the future. In this context, semiconductors and currency have become twin battlegrounds in a quiet but far-reaching struggle for dominance. When the United States imposed tighter export controls on advanced chips, it sought not only to limit China's access to critical technology, but also to demonstrate that Washington could weaponize global supply chains as a geopolitical tool. Beijing interpreted this as a strategic warning. Dependence on foreign semiconductors threatened the security of China's digital infrastructure. Consequently, China began treating semiconductor self-reliance not merely as an economic ambition, but as a matter of national security, investing heavily in domestic chip development, funding research, and encouraging local firms to reduce reliance on U.S. technology. This approach signals a long-term commitment to technological sovereignty, while simultaneously reinforcing financial independence, reflecting a coordinated strategy to challenge U.S. global dominance across both money and technology. The Chinese government launched massive funding programs to develop domestic semiconductor industries, foster innovation, and create a technology ecosystem capable of surviving without reliance on American inputs. State-backed investment funds, tax incentives, and support for local firms all work toward the same goal: technological self-reliance. At the same time, China has accelerated efforts to internationalize the yuan, enabling a growing share of trade to be conducted without using the U.S. dollar. These dual strategies are not isolated policies. They serve a single strategic purpose: reducing exposure to American influence while building parallel systems of economic and technological power that Washington cannot easily disrupt. Russia, although coming from a different starting point, follows a similar logic. After repeated waves of Western sanctions froze its assets and restricted access to dollar-based financial systems, Moscow experienced firsthand how financial tools could be weaponized. In response, Russia pivoted eastward, deepening economic and financial ties with China and developing a framework where the ruble and yuan take precedence over the dollar in bilateral trade. This strategy allowed Russia to continue exporting energy and importing critical goods despite Western restrictions, maintaining economic stability while aligning politically and strategically with Beijing. For both nations, the integration of technology and finance is central to their long-term vision. China's tech ambitions require secure, reliable payment and trade systems that cannot be blocked by foreign powers. Russia's financial realignment relies on technological cooperation to develop industries outside Western control. Each country supports the other as they build parallel infrastructures designed to circumvent traditional global systems. Both governments now share the view that the U.S. dollar, long considered a symbol of financial stability, has become a weapon wielded by Washington to enforce its will globally. Every sanction, trade restriction, or dollar-denominated rule reinforces that perception, driving a coordinated effort to create independent technology networks and non-dollar financial systems. In their perspective, breaking free from the dollar and the Western-dominated tech ecosystem is not merely defensive. It is the foundation of a new kind of sovereignty and global influence. The growing alignment between China and Russia in both technology and finance is shifting the global balance of power in profound ways, with deep implications for every major economy. For the United States, the immediate concern lies in the weakening of two pillars that have historically underpinned its global dominance: the dollar's supremacy and leadership in advanced semiconductor technology. As more countries trade using alternative currencies, Washington's ability to leverage the dollar as a geopolitical and economic tool diminishes. Similarly, China's accelerated development of domestic chips, driven by U.S. export restrictions, threatens American companies' access to one of the largest markets in the world. Reduced access impacts profits for U.S. tech giants and gradually erodes the innovation ecosystem that thrives on global demand and interconnected supply chains. The leverage that once allowed the United States to shape global technology standards and international trade rules could slowly diminish. For China and Russia, this shift presents both opportunity and challenge. Both nations gain greater autonomy in finance and technology, allowing freer trade without the constant threat of sanctions and enabling investment in local production over reliance on imports. Yet, these advantages come with substantial hurdles. China still faces a technological gap in advanced semiconductor manufacturing. Closing it will require time, substantial investment, and access to high-end tools that remain largely controlled by Western countries. While the yuan is increasingly used in international trade, it has not yet achieved full global acceptance as a stable reserve currency. Russia must manage an economy still fragile from sanctions and heavily dependent on fluctuating energy prices. Both nations are learning that autonomy carries costs, requiring sustained coordination, patience, and strategic planning. For the broader international community, these developments create both opportunities and risks. Countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East now have alternatives to conduct trade, with some joining China's yuan-based payment systems, while others explore local currency agreements to mitigate exposure to dollar volatility. This diversification may balance international trade, but it also risks fragmenting the global financial system. Instead of a single, unified structure dominated by the dollar, the world could evolve into competing regional economic blocs, each with distinct currency arrangements, regulatory frameworks, and strategic alliances. Such a multipolar financial environment would reshape global power dynamics, redefine trade relationships, and force major economies, including the United States, to adapt to a world where old levers of influence are no longer guaranteed. The global economic landscape is undergoing a profound transformation, and the technology sector lies at the center of this shift. Semiconductor supply chains, once tightly interwoven across nations, are now beginning to realign. Manufacturers, designers, and suppliers may find themselves excluded from certain markets as national strategies diverge. In China, aggressive state investment is driving domestic chip production and innovation, fostering an ecosystem that could operate independently of American technology. At the same time, new regional semiconductor ecosystems are emerging in Southeast Asia, India, and the Middle East, providing alternatives to traditional supply chains. Countries seeking to reduce dependency on both the U.S. and China are actively exploring these new networks. The competition for technological dominance is no longer simply about which country produces the fastest chip. It is about who controls the systems that design, produce, and finance them. The next phase of this ongoing power struggle depends on how far China and Russia are willing to push their current strategies and how effectively the United States can respond. Analysts are closely monitoring whether Beijing will escalate from selective restrictions to a comprehensive formal ban on U.S.-made chips. So far, the measures remain targeted, affecting sensitive sectors such as government systems, military-linked industries, and critical infrastructure. However, as domestic chip manufacturing capacity grows and Chinese alternatives improve, the probability of a broader ban increases. The more important question is not only whether such a ban will be announced, but whether it can be effectively enforced. China's economy is vast, with thousands of private companies still reliant on American semiconductors for everything from smartphones to cloud computing servers. Implementing a full ban would require extensive coordination across multiple industries, which could take years to achieve effectively. Meanwhile, speculation is growing about the creation of a new financial network jointly developed by Russia and China, designed to function independently of Western-controlled systems. Both nations have already established alternative payment platforms, Russia's SPFS and China's CIPS. These platforms serve as substitutes for the SWIFT network, historically dominated by American and European financial institutions. Discussions are underway to link these networks, creating a seamless cross-border payment system that could facilitate direct transactions in yuan or rubles without ever touching the US dollar. If fully implemented, this system could become the financial backbone for a growing number of countries seeking to reduce their reliance on dollar-based mechanisms. Energy exporters, emerging markets, and members of regional alliances such as BRICS may find this model increasingly attractive as a hedge against dollar volatility and Western sanctions. The consequences of this transformation extend far beyond Russia and China. More nations may begin adopting local currencies for bilateral trade, reduce their dollar reserves, and strengthen regional financial collaboration. India has already begun settling a portion of its oil trade in rupees, and countries in the Middle East are experimenting with yuan-based energy contracts. Over time, these initiatives could pave the way for new regional reserve currencies supported by digital payment systems and commodity-backed assets. Washington is unlikely to remain passive. The United States continues to hold enormous financial leverage, backed by the world's largest consumer market and deep capital markets central to global trade. In response, the U.S. may implement new sanctions, enforce stricter technology export controls, or reinforce alliances with chip-producing nations such as Japan, South Korea, and the Netherlands. Diplomatic engagement will also play a key role, aiming to reassure allies about the stability of the dollar while discouraging participation in alternative systems. The coming years will test how adaptable the U.S. can be as the long-standing instruments of American influence, the dollar and advanced technology, face the strongest challenge in decades. The global struggle over semiconductor technology and the shift away from dollar reliance are not separate phenomena. They are intertwined fronts in a broader geopolitical realignment. China's technological independence initiatives and Russia's break from dollar dependency together challenge decades of U.S. economic dominance. This ongoing transformation marks a turning point that could fundamentally reshape global trade, technology development, and financial systems. What appears to be gradual today could, over time, redefine the foundational structures of the world economy. The critical question is no longer if change is occurring, but how extensive it will be and who will emerge stronger in the new era. Will the US dollar maintain its position as the world's dominant currency? Or are we witnessing the rise of a new financial and technological order led by China and its strategic partners? Share your insights and perspectives in the comments below. Your voice matters in this unfolding global conversation. If you found this analysis valuable, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and activate the notification bell to stay updated on our latest in-depth coverage of world-changing events. The global landscape is evolving rapidly, and we are committed to keeping you informed and one step ahead of these transformative developments.